lived in this house? How old were you?
I was probably 5 or 6 or 7 along that. I don't know. I was born on the street
Really?
in a house that is no longer there. And later on, when Michael was born, we lived there for a short time. That house was demolished for the New York State Thruway that you can hear in the background right now. And so I was a little guy in those years, and I used to come over here from our home on the other side of the Kelly house. The Kelly family was an immigrant family from Southern Ireland, the Republic, as my grandmother was. Came over here at the age of 16, I believe she was, when she emigrated to the United States from Southern Ireland. And so my grandmother lived here by herself. Her husband was kind of a drinker, and I never had much communication with him down through the years. I only saw him once when I was playing out in the back, and he came walking by and stopped and looked at me. I looked at him. There was no conversation, but I knew it was him for some reason. I don't know why. And he was either kicked out of the house or decided to leave the family. My grandmother lived here with her children. Actually, my mother and the boys and the whole family moved from Buffalo into this home, as I understand it. And they eventually, my brothers, my uncles, who were very kind to me, wonderful people, they really kind of spoiled us kids, and they spoiled me to some extent. They were just wonderful to us. But they lived here. My uncles lived here with my grandmother, and of course my mother lived here in her younger years, into her teen years until she married. They all went off in different directions. Ultimately, my Uncle Johnny lived here with my grandmother, and then he and his wife had children, and they lived together. That family lived with my grandmother here at one time.
What were your other brothers' names?
There was Jerry, Connie, Johnny, and Jerome, 4 brothers, and my mother. There were 5 children in the family. And Johnny and my grandmother evidently worked out some kind of a deal back in the early 50s, and she decided to go out to Ireland. Maybe he worked up a mortgage and paid it off, or however it worked out. My grandmother left in the early 50s, went back to Ireland and lived there in Rosslare Harbour in the Republic of Ireland. For, I believe, 8 years she lived afterwards, and then she ultimately died of a stroke. And members of my family and I visited her after my grandmother died. We visited her with Maggie and her daughter in Rosslare Harbour, and they talked about my grandmother and how she and Maggie had used to get around in a horse and buggy even in the 50s. They didn't have a car. And we had a lot of stories. We went around and visited with members of my family. You guys weren't there, but the rest of the 6 kids were there, from Jeff on Sherry and on down. And went to the same old areas. We went to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. We went to another cemetery surrounded by the ruins of Norman castles. Our Lady's Island, they called it, or something like that. There was a statue of White and my Blessed Mother there. And the cemetery was closed down. But my great-grandfather, Daniel Doyle, and his wife, once wife, Eleanor Wiley Doyle, were both buried in the same grave in that particular graveyard. So anyways, about this area, I can remember quite a few incidents here. I remember this lawn that I was cutting one day in the middle of summer. It was a lot warmer than it is today, and collapsing from heat prostration, woke up inside the house. I remember there being a black hand, a painted hand on the side of the house. It was there for years because the house wasn't repainted, and I always thought to myself, I wonder if I was the one that did that. And I remember right here there was a really nice garden with all kinds of sunflowers that would come up and turn, in the daytime. And there was a flagpole here with an American flag up on top, run up and down with ropes. And my grandmother would come in here in the morning in the sunlight, and her hair was all the way down below her waist, and she would sit there brushing her hair. I can recall that very clearly. Also climbing that flagpole, getting a little altitude and having this feeling of, a height or whatever. I remember living with my grandmother on the second floor for one time, and seeing her false teeth in a glass of salt water where she stored them when we went to sleep at night. And I remember our cat, a black cat by the name of Murphy. And during the night, Murphy came up and he was snuggling up to my throat, and I grabbed a hold of fur and his neck and I tossed him across the room. And I guess maybe that's where I developed my dislike for cats. I remember this building in the back. That's a garage, and where my Uncle Connie had pigeons up on the upper second floor there. And I used to love to go up there and look at the pigeons and hear them coo and their little melodies, and it was very wonderful. I remember getting into an old car one of them had there and starting it up, and the car moved forward but not far enough to cause any walls to fall out or, to demolish the garage. And I got a little chastisement for that. I remember my grandmother having some chickens and a cock who was very, very aggressive. And he used to chase me around the yard, and I'd try to escape. And I also remember my mom was telling me that if I used salt and put them on the back of the birds and so forth, pheasants in the field, I could catch them, and I tried that, but it never worked, and they used to laugh about that. And then pulling the George Washington trick, there was a nice tree out back of that garage at the time, and it was the fall of the year, and I went out there with my hatchet. I can't remember if I was a Cub Scout or I was just being an explorer or whatever, but I would go in the back there. I went in the back at that time, and I took my hatchet and I chopped that tree down. And when people said, that was a perfectly good tree, my relatives said, my uncles, why did you chop it down? And I said, well, it was dead. There were no leaves on it. They said, well, all trees, living trees have leaves on them that fall away in the fall of the year. Well, they got a big kick out of it.
Was there a house over on this side, Dad, when you lived here, or was it just field?
Our house was on the other side. I'll get into that.
No, but was there a house here on this side?
This is the
Nelson, same house? Oh, Nelson.
The Nelson. Okay. Yeah, there was a lady here who was really, they were a wonderful family. I can't remember. They were Norwegian, I think. And I think that I remember the mother in the house of being quite a large lady, maybe well over 200 pounds. And I remember as a kid telling my mother at Christmas time, I didn't want to go over and get one of Mrs. Nelson's stockings for my Christmas stocking. So I have a lot more stuff in that Santa would bring me. But we had some happy times here. We had some good times. For whatever reason, my grandmother was very suspicious all the time of this family next door, the Kelly family. As I said, they were immigrants also, and they were wonderful people. The mom and the dad were great, and the kids were playing with our kids all the time. I forget how many. They had probably 6 or 7 kids in the family altogether. And some of them, I remember Ethel was one of the daughters, and Ethel and I would walk all the way down the road, on the way to Main Street, up into Williamsville at St. Peter and Paul's School, to and from school. And some of the other kids would do the same thing down through the years. We didn't have school buses. They didn't allow parochial school kids to use the public school buses. So winter or summer or spring or fall or whatever time of the year it was, or whatever the weather, inclement weather or what, we walked it. And we walked it back. And we never rode for public transportation, or ordinary transportation as they allow these days. But I also remember the good relationships that my mother and stepfather had with the Kelly family, with the adults. They would get together on Saturday nights, and they would play Pedro was a big game, a big card game, and other card games they would play. They had good times. There was no drunkenness and that kind of thing. It was just families and adults getting together and enjoying themselves and not spending a lot of money to enjoy themselves because people couldn't afford it down through those Depression year times back in the 30s. It was very difficult for families. And Mr. Kelly had a job with Colonial Radio downtown Buffalo. There was no bus service along Union Road here, and he would walk all the way down to Main Street, take a bus all the way downtown to his job, finish up his duties, drive back in the bus back to Union Road and Main Street and walk back home. 5 days a
How
week.
far is it to Main Street from here? do you
I'd
think?
say probably a good half mile or 3/4. I don't know. I never clocked it. I'm not sure. But we did the same thing as kids, but it was easier for kids than a guy in middle age and so forth in the U.S. And there was a really a kind of a community spirit in this neighborhood, except for my grandmother's attitude toward the Kellys. They decided next door in the Kelly home to have a basement, and it was a foundational setup. So the neighborhood guys got together, and they jacked the house up, and we got in there with shovels and buckets and wheelbarrows and dug in and took all that earth out of there. I don't know where in the world they put it. And they put a whole basement in underneath the house at the time, which was a wonderful thing to see people do. I remember working at that. And I'll tell you the kind of a great person that they were. We used to play a game called Kick the Can. And Mr. Kelly had a car parked out in the driveway years later, but I was still a kid at the time. And I was playing Kick the Can with his kids, and I gave the can a big kick, and it went up and hit the headlight on the car, broke the headlight. And he just said, "Don't worry about it, it's not a problem." You know, it's just one of those things that happens with kids. They were very, very nice people. We really liked them. And we lived across the way here. I believe there were like 4 acres of kind of farmland here, but it wasn't really tilled. And then our house sat there. And we used to walk through there. And I remember one time walking in the summertime merrily along with a book of matches and lighting matches and tossing them in the air and letting them fall on the ground. And suddenly I heard this kind of an ominous sound behind me. I turned around. The field was on fire. And all the neighbors came with wet blankets. They ran out and they attacked the flames, then they put it down. And I remember for another reason, there was another kind of heat that was coming along in my life at that time, because my stepfather came home and he was told by my mother, "Donald has to be disciplined about this." And so I got a little bit of a tanning for having performed this terrible act. And then on the other side of us, there was the German immigrant family, the Heims. And we had a good relationship with them. They were part of the card group too, the beer drinking group when they went and had some beers. And we had a good time sometimes playing in the back with them, with the kids and the girls, and having Halloween parties, ducking for apples, and enjoying ourselves, really having some great relationships. We'd walk with them also to school occasionally and back, a long trip. And I think that I remember having some excavations done in front of the house where a neighborhood of mine, a neighbor boy across the street here, Tommy Dustin and I, we would put planks over the ditches that they built, and then we would get candles and we would go in there under the ground and under the planks, and then we were in caves and we get that candle smell, and we were, again, explorer types, you know, living dangerously. But one of the incidents that happened with the Heim family was with the adults. I don't know, I guess we were kept in the car at the time. We got way down toward Lockport and Tonawanda Creek area. And then there was a tavern down there, and I believe it was operated by some German immigrants also, or anyways, German people. And there was one day I recall when my folks were there, and the Heims, the adults, and some other German people would come, and they would drink beer and have a good time, and we would play around on the outside. But I remember being in there when they all got together and they would sing this song, "Hooray for Georgie, hooray for Georgie." Someone in the crowd yelled, "Hooray for Georgie, 1, 2, 3, 4. Georgie is the boy who buys us beer." And I still remember that refrain for some reason. I don't know why. But we had some great times here. It was a good community spirit. People didn't have a lot of money. The Heims were kind of regarded with a little suspicion by some people in town. Frank Heim was a plumber and a good one, and I think that at the time the Germans, the Nazis, were regarded, with a lot of animosity, and German immigrants, that they might be spies or whatever. There was a certain attitude about it, and I think it made them suffer a little bit. But they were good people, hard-working people. And we had a good relationship with them. We enjoyed it. And I remember meeting Renee Heim once. She went to school with me, at St. Peter and Paul's up until she graduated from 8th grade. And I recall one time that she said that she used to love to come over to our home in the morning before we went to school. And my mother, for health purposes, would dole out to all of us kids a tablespoonful of American oil for laxative purposes. And she said, I used to love that American oil. That was great stuff. And I used to hate it. And not only American oil, but the big deal in those days, if you had any kind of a stomach ailment, was castor oil. And I can still taste American oil, but even hated more was the castor oil. And I never got near that stuff after that. It was the end of that. I guess I'm not an oil tycoon of any kind. But it was a good relationship, and we lost touch with my grandmother when we were married. We moved away overseas. We had more interest in our own family of growing children, and the communication lines broke down, and the communication lines were troubled between my mother and my grandmother for whatever reason. My grandmother was a difficult person for various reasons. She had a kind of a negative impression of people, and especially the Kelly family. So it was kind of a negative. And then there was another family behind us, the Sweeney family. They had a business involving providing linens for hotels and restaurants, and a very successful business. But they had these beautiful girls, these teenage girls in the Sweeney family, and we used to get back here and we'd have amateur hours and we would sing the current songs together, you know. For some reason they were kind of impressed with some of my renditions, I guess, as I remember, but I was more interested in their beauty than their singing. It was an interesting amateur hour experience for me, and that just gave it the tip off of where my attentions were in those days, because I was about 7 or 8 at the time. So whatever that was all about, I'm not quite sure.
When did your mom move out of this area then? When did she transition out of this house?
My mother was in her teens, and she somehow, maybe it was the school connection, because Norman Rogers, who is my father, lived with his family down the road here, maybe half a mile down the road. That was a farm family that came in from Gettsville to the north, and they leased out the property and they built a house right there. And however my mother and my stepfather got together, I was born. When I was born, I believe she was 16 years old. And so she and my stepfather married, and so that was the point where she moved out. And that would have been, obviously, I was born in 1927, so that was when she moved.
So she was living here when she met your Norman Rogers?
And also, at one point in there, prior to that, my mother, in those days with the poorer families, used to send their children out for work wherever they could get it. And my mother, shortly before that, in her early teens, I presume, shortly before these events happened, she was sent down to a family near Baltimore, a very well-to-do family where the father of the family, the husband, was a railroad executive in a very well-to-do family, and she worked there for a couple of years as a domestic. And later on, the Whitman family. And later on, when I was in the Foreign Service, my mother and I, she must have arranged it. I don't recall all the details of it, but we went and visited Mrs. Whitman. Her husband had passed away, and she was a widow, and had invited us to come. So we took her out to lunch at a local restaurant and told stories about those years and the like. I think that my mother was kind of proud to be able to say that, here's my son, and he's done pretty well. Maybe my education wasn't that great, or my achievements. I'm surmising this. That's why she arranged it. I don't know what the background of her arrangement was, but I was kind of glad that had happened too. And then she was able to be there with Mrs. Whitman, and it was very cordial, very pleasant. There was no attitude of Mrs. Whitman part of being in the station in life beyond your family. You might have thought that, but it was very friendly, and I was glad it happened. It was one of those things that was very interesting.
Do you know how and when she met your stepfather? Jay?
No, the only thing I know was that right down in the corner of Union Road and Main Street, there was a Tidal gas station. And my stepfather and his brother, Jay Weaver is his stepfather, and his brother was Clarence Weaver. They worked as station attendants down there. And that was very near. The ladies would walk right down past that area. And I recall one of my aunts in the Rogers family talking about how attractive she felt and how interesting it was to walk by there as young ladies past these two gentlemen, in this gas station. And how they really got together. Beyond that, I never heard. My mother never told me, but only one brief little story, if you want to call it that, a fact about how she happened to come together. She only mentioned that very fleetingly. She never gave me many details. She never told me herself, or wrote the news to me that Jay Weaver Sr. was my father, and Norman was not my father, and Norman Rogers was my father. And so I don't know anything. She never gave me the information I would be very glad to have now. It was never there. So we were poor folks. We came from difficult circumstances. We had good times here. We never had a lot of other families probably had in the way of incomes. My stepfather worked for the WPA. I can recall him working on sewer projects right on this road, on Union Road, down toward Main Street, running a jackhammer, knocking into rock and digging trenches and so forth. And then my mother and my stepfather both worked for Bell Aeronautics, Bell Aerocobra, or whatever the name of the organization was, over toward Niagara Falls, all during the war. But then, of course, when the war ended, World War II, they were let go like thousands of other people. And then my stepfather worked as a truck driver in Williamsville for $20 a week. This was back right after the war, when there weren't a lot of jobs around. And somehow we were able to get home in Williamsville and South Union Road, which was built by the Rogers family. They were largely a farm family earlier, and they moved into Williamsville here, at least the farm out in the area of Medina and that section of New York State. And they moved here, and after the home was constructed for a time, and then the lease soured. It didn't work out, so the family moved back out to the farm in Gettsville. And so Aunt Jenny Rogers, whose husband had passed away, Ray, she came to this home, and her daughter Marcia and Jean lived upstairs for quite some time. And Aunt Jen was a marvelous person, and we had no association with the Rogers family for decades and generations, because of the family history that we had of my mother and Norman Rogers. So Tina, one of my daughters, was putting the pressure on us to try to pick up the ties and get some history of the family. And so my wife Nancy telephoned Aunt Jen. She telephoned Norman's wife, and she referred her to Aunt Jen. And so she invited Nancy to come over and talk, which she did. She came over and she told her that there was a connection and revealed what was going on. And I imagine that Aunt Jen was pretty shocked to hear it, although she had heard some rumors about it years earlier. But she told us afterwards that she was looking at Nancy and she said, "This girl is my niece. I can't believe this is going on." So the ground was laid to have me connect with Aunt Jen to get reestablished or established ties. So I called her up and we talked for a time, and she had told Nancy to tell me to call her. She said to tell Buck to call, because I won't bite. And so I did. And we talked for a while, and I said, "I'd like to meet with you." And she was reluctant at first. And she said, "I'm not sure it's a good idea." And she changed her mind, and then she invited me to come, and I came, and we had a long talk and discussed the whole issue, the family relations, the background. And after an hour or so of conversation, she said, "I'll take you down to the farm in the country in Gettsville and tell you more." So,
To be continued. Let's go to the back so we can hear.
And another family bought that home. The Charlots, they were called, the name of the family. And so somehow we found out about this place. At that time it was more like a bungalow with one story. And we must have lived here probably for at least a couple of years. I'm not quite sure how long it was. And I remember not only did we have a growing family of our own, but my uncles, one in particular I can recall, Jerome, lived with us for a time. And there were regular partitions in the home. And we strung rope across and put sheets over the rope, partitioned the section of the home off so one or more of the uncles could stay here from time to time. We stayed here for that length of time. There was an open field behind us. The Crosbys lived over the way, and I used to play with the boy, the Crosby boy, baseball field behind here. I think we played marbles here, shooters and so forth. And then we moved from this place. The Hartmans lived next door. Joe Hartman was an auto mechanic. He used to do all the repairs in that garage right there. And he was a great bowler. I remember him bowling. He could raise that ball behind him straight up like looked like it was 8 feet in the air at least, and fire it down there. And then the Hartmans had two children, two young girls. One of them we used to play. She married Hubert Klein's brother, and she used to come, and he used to come down to Clymer and play with our golfing group. Also, he went to Bryant Stratton at the same time that I did, and we used to carpool. He and Mike Brown, a gentleman who had a car and drove us, we used to pay him $1 or $2 a week for carpooling. And Jay and I, because Jay went to Bryant Stratton for less than a year, and he left and went into the construction business laying block. But we had good memories, I guess we would say, from this place. At that time, years ago, there was a railroad embankment all the way along here, running right through Williamsville, and the bridge was right down here. And my stepfather at one time had a job in a tidal service station, so he had a very short commute. It was just a matter of walking down this short way and going there, and he used to take care of the pumps, pumping gas there from time to time. And I can recall during the 30s also, and I think we lived here at the time, and he worked in the WPA program initiated by Franklin Roosevelt to find jobs for the unemployed. And I can remember him working on a sewer project with a jackhammer, blasting rock. It was all rock underneath that road, and they had to blast out trenches to build the sewer through there. And I was so impressed by when he operated that jackhammer and his muscles. You could see his muscles in his arms. I can still remember.
Was this Jay Sr., Dad? So Grandma Weaver and Jay Sr. lived in this house after they got married?
Yeah.
Is this the first house?
This was after the home up further south.
Simer's
By
home.
my
Your grandma's Simer's home.
And how long did it take you to walk from here up to there to visit her? Or were you allowed to walk?
I would
in?
say 10 minutes maybe. I don't remember. We used to walk from that area all the way down here to Main Street, and then down Main Street to St. Peter and Paul School. And then we would walk back again, at the end of the day. So to us, it was just customary to do it. You didn't worry about it. And later on, when we moved over to South Forest Road from here, North Forest Road, that Faith was talking about the impressions we had about what a difference it was living in a place like this and living there. We used to walk from there, either up Forest Road to Main Street and down and back, or we would take a shortcut along the railroad tracks that I was mentioning to you. And where they had that site, there was a building supply company, Amherst Builders it was called. And that's where we got our coal to fuel our furnace in the wintertime. And that's where Jay and I, when we were in the construction business, used to buy our supplies for the masonry business, to lay block, mortar, and sand, and whatever we needed, implements even, to handle the work.
Was this the first house that Jay Sr. and Grandma lived in, though?
No.
After they got married? Where did they...
We lived in the other one before that. They lived
Oh,
on-
in Grandma Simer's house?
No, we lived in a home north of my grandmother's house and the Kelly house next door, as I explained in the
Right.
previous video.
Right.
There was the field, and then there was a
Okay.
home, and that we lived in that home. My mother and Glenn lived. My mother and my stepfather, Jay Weaver Sr., lived for a while in an apartment of some kind on Main Street in Williamsville. And my aunt Edith Rogers said that she would see me out there when I was a little tiny toddler, maybe in a walker or whatever I was in, but she said she would look at that and she would marvel and notice how much I resembled Norman, my father, Norman Rogers. And she knew what was going on with that situation and commented about it to me a couple of times. She mentioned that, but she never let on. It wasn't done. You didn't let those secrets out at the time. It was an entirely different situation. After moving from the Plymouth Place home, my family moved down here on Forest Road, 64 North Forest Road. And my sister the other day commented what a contrast there was between that little postage-size lot and what it was like here, coming with this huge expanse of lawn along here. We came at dusk, just when it was getting dark, and the grass on our bare feet. We ran around just like it was a circus for us. We were just milling around and running because it just felt like we could run for miles, and it was just so different. The whole aura, the atmosphere of coming to this home was like we were moving up in the world. And we spent years here then. That was in the late 30s. I can't remember, it was 1938, along in that period of time, that we lived here. And I, of course, was here the entire time that I went to high school, to Newman High School, from 1941 to 1945. And at that time, the home was not finished off upstairs. There was a family, the Atiyah family, who owned the home. And we paid them rent all the years that we stayed here. And eventually, the home was kind of improved. There used to be a barn right over in that section where that asphalt is. A big red barn, kind of a broken down structure. But my folks used to have beer parties in there, invite all their friends over. We, at that time, had a driveway running all the way out to Forest Road. And that's what we had to keep plowed in the wintertime. We would plow it out with the big drifts so the coal trucks would get through, and so we could get out to get to school and the like. And once in a while, when we had a car available to get back and forth, next morning we had to go out and it was all filled in again because of the winter snows in the Buffalo area. So we got plenty of exertion in those days, and we were very fit, obviously. After we I left after Nancy and I were married in 1948. We left here and moved around with the Goodyear Company and never really came back here. Faith and Jerry were living in Buffalo at that time, and they were looking for a place to live, and my mother had remarried Glenn Stark. I'll tell you a little about that, and then we should the church or vice versa, whichever one you want to do. School at Newman High School, all the way through from grade school up through high school, and graduated. I have quite a few stories about this church. Father Walter Fornes was the pastor, and we were good friends. He was very good to boys. He loved sports. He was the coach of our basketball team and our baseball team, and he took us to many places. Up in the Adirondack Mountains a couple of times, to New York City. He took us to sporting events. The top basketball teams in the area. He used to come and play at the auditorium downtown Buffalo, and he would buy tickets for us. We went to wrestling matches, we went to hockey games, we went to baseball games at his expense. And one day Jay and I were out here playing baseball, and I hit a ball, and it went into one of the plate glass windows and broke it. So I had to go and confess to Father Fornes, and I rang the bell, and he came out, and I explained what happened. And I think it happened twice. We went back and we did it again, and I had to do it a second time, a second window. And I said, "I'm sorry, Father. I didn't think I could hit the ball that far." He said, "Hit the ball that far?" He said, "John Kuhn hit the ball over the church. What are you talking about?" As this was where we attended Mass every day all the way through grade school and high school. We walked from our home on Union Road all the way down here, probably a mile and a half every day, summer or winter, didn't matter. And then again back, and you thought nothing of it because we weren't allowed to use public school buses. The buses ran, but parochial school kids weren't allowed to take the bus service. The church here, when I first started going to school here, there's only the high school building. On this side, there was no grade school building. This was an old, ramshackle, beaten up old building where we had classes 1 through 8. And my good friend Bud Zimmerman lived with his family in an old building right on the other side of the church for a time. It was more of a home. Then back in there was a convent for the nuns, Sisters of St. Francis, who later on moved to a more modern building down on Mill Street. But the Zimmerman family lived also in that ramshackle place. And later on, they finally got the money together to tear that down and put the other wing of the school to make this L-shaped building. Years after I was gone, the building went up, the rest of it went up.
What do they use this for now, do you know? Is it still a school?
This is the Country Club of Buffalo, where I caddied all the way pretty much through high school. When I was 14 years old, I had to get working papers and brought them out here and signed up. I was caddy number 209, an apprentice, and when I started out I earned 85 cents a round, and I had to go through lessons on how to be a good caddy. The pro here, Charlie Bemis, used to teach young people the fine art of being a caddy, where to stand, how to go ahead on a hole, to watch for it, never stand over the hole with your shadow, never move in the line of a person putting, all the fine points in the etiquette of not only caddying, but you learned about golf by observing golfers and having a chance to come out here as a caddy in the summertime and play on Mondays. It was Caddy's Day, and sometimes you would play with the members. And I loved caddying. We had a good deal. I brought my little working papers out here and presented them to the caddy master, Bill O'Brien, who was a very affable Irishman with a great big stomach. And he had a knack of pulling his stomach and his pants would drop. And he also would move his jaws and his false teeth would pop out. But he was a very, very funny man and loved by the caddies, and a very fair man. So we would come out here and sign up for caddying, and you didn't always get out, but what we would do is put your name on the list. He would do it, put your name on the list, and then you would come back the next day in the summertime or Saturday over to Sunday, and you would move up on the list, and then when your name came up, you would be the caddy. And during the war, we used to carry doubles. As I proceeded, I was caddy number 209, Herc Moses was 210. We came together and applied to be caddies. And then we, later on, the proceeds, the fee rose, and you would carry doubles for $3, which is a pretty good money in those days, back during the war years, 41 through 45. But there was another pretty good perk, and that is if you came out after school, which I did. We got out of school at 2:45, jumped on our bikes and hopped all the way out here. If you got to the 6th hole and picked up a group that had started out without caddies, because they didn't have golf carts in those days, you got the full $3. Plus, sometimes you would get a tip. If you were caddied for J.R. O'Shea, who ran the Trico factory, or the Trico Corporation in Buffalo, you got a 50-cent tip. If you caddied for Doug McLeod, who was a Scotchman, you got 10 cents a dime as your tip. And either way, you accepted it and went on. And I also, after a year or two, I was hired to work in the pro shop and polishing clubs and doing odd jobs, a kind of a step up. I don't remember what the pay was, but it was lucrative for a young person without a lot of opportunities for employment to be able to come out here and be in the sunshine, the fresh air, play golf. I recall one time playing number 13 hole with a member, the same Chandler Wells who bought the Beck home on Evans Street, and he was in the foursome, one member and 3 caddies, and he hit a drive on number 13, and I remember him saying, "Bite on that one, boys." And I remember catching the hold of the ball pretty well and marching out there to the drives, and he couldn't believe my ball was past his. And I didn't act like I was, a power man or anything, but I was pretty pleased at the time. Those are fun days. Big Terror and I and all the guys, we'd come out here, and when you weren't caddying or waiting, you'd be playing football or baseball in the grounds someplace and enjoying yourself. And it was a wonderful course, as you could see, perfectly groomed. You just couldn't come out here with an ordinary paycheck and be a member of this club. It would cost thousands of dollars to belong to this club. It was an incredible place. As you can see by the layout and the beauty of the buildings, it's a very unusual ultra country club, the Country Club of Buffalo. And Hope Krebs also worked here in the building. I don't know if it was in the dining room or where. I came out and played with her and her husband one time, a round of golf later on. And some of some of the people I idolized as athletes from Newman High School, who were older than we were, they would come out here and play once in a while, and we would play with them and admire their games. They could hit the ball, some of these people, like a professional. And that was a lot of fun. But it was a great activity. It's a shame in the sport that more clubs don't have caddies, because it's a way of life that teaches young people how to handle money, how to work hard to earn that money, how to play the game. And I learned so much about golf just by observing the way things work, the way that how to strike the ball, how to play sand shots, how to work the ball left and right, all the refinements of the game. I recommend it for a young person if they really want to learn. But unfortunately, very few clubs have caddies anymore, and it's a real loss to the sport and to young people who could learn a lot from it. Ellicott Creek, where my father, Norman Rogers, sold meats and groceries in a little sort of a convenience store. One day, we came in here, Nancy and Mike, when they were a little kid, they came in here, and we walked in, and Nancy used to buy groceries here, little items once in a while. And Norman came over and was talking to Nancy and Mike, and he tousled Mike's hair. I was kind of standing in the background. We never revealed what was going on. I have no idea whether he realized who it was, probably not. And I didn't make any overtures or recognize him in terms of our relationship. It stuck in my mind all those years. And then later on, the store, I think maybe a couple of other stores in the area were heavily damaged by a fire and later torn down. And this is the result. There were a couple of buildings along here. I'm not sure how old that church is. It might have been there. I'm not sure. But this is the location where the stores were, right along this area. Her family moved. I can't give you the exact year, but they moved here from Kenmore. Nancy was born in Buffalo. The family moved to Kenmore, and then later Nancy's grandfather, Louis Beck's dad, was a maitre d' at the Statler Hotel in Buffalo, a very well-to-do gentleman with a lot of rental properties, well-heeled, you might say. He advanced $5,000 for Louis Beck, Nancy's father, to buy this home. $5,000, and in those days it was a lot of money. I can't give you the exact year, And they moved in and they loved the place. Nancy writes about it a great deal in her memoirs, and Donna remembers it very favorably. And we had this gentleman in the area who used to come in, an insurance tycoon of some kind, and he loved his home. And he kept coming back and back and back, offering money to buy the home, and the family loved it so much they refused the offer until we got up to $11,000. I thought it was $10,000, as Nancy remembered. Donna remembers $11,000, and at that point he decided, I better take it. So he sold the home, and I think he lived for a time with his folks. Maybe Doris lived also there with the folks. I don't know where she went. But Nancy lived with her grandmother in Williamsville for quite a while, until they finally closed the deal on a home in South Long Street here in Williamsville, and they moved from here. And this home, the last I heard, there was a very well-to-do gentleman in Buffalo who's very well known by the name of Seymour Knox. The Seymour Knox Art Gallery is named after him in the city, and he owned the Knox Farm in East Aurora, which I believe is owned now by the state of New York, or possibly he turned it over to the East Aurora municipality. And it's my understanding, I'm not sure if it's true now, but that his widow, up until recent years, resided in this home. And obviously it's kind of shielded, you can't really make it out like it should be, like it was then, with all this foliage and so forth. But this is the home that they enjoyed the most, the family enjoyed, of all the homes that they had. They loved this home. And it was so convenient for Nancy to go to school right down this street. Within the next block is where she went to school. She graduated from this school, was one of the last who graduated that class in 1947. And then by that time they had built Williamsville Central School on Main Street, a former cattle ranch. And of course that was still there. Donna graduated from Williamsville Central High School. That Nancy went to, Williamsville High School. She went here for 4 years before graduating. I remember coming here with the Newman High School baseball team and even the basketball team, and we competed against Williamsville High School. She graduated from this school in 1947, and Donna went on to go to school at Williamsville Central High School. Nancy had a good friend, Lois Farber, and Mr. Farber was, I believe, an insurance agent of some kind, very well-to-do, maybe investor or whatever. And he owned this very large cattle farm just on the edge of the village. And Nancy used to come with Lois Farber to that cattle ranch, and they would ride. And Fred Nadel, Fred, her brother-in-law, was a little guy. He was a stable boy in that, taking care of the horses. And Lois and Nancy and Fred would, when Fred didn't have to work, they would mount the horses, and they would come here frequently and canter around in the whole area. There's plenty of room to ride horses on this big cattle ranch at the time. Interestingly enough, a very famous American author, Joyce Carol Oates, lived out in the Spormsville, Bowmansville area, north on Transit Road toward Lockport, and she matriculated at Williamsville Central High School and graduated from that school, and went on to the great fame that she has now as one of the leading American novelists, and also is on the staff at Princeton University teaching humanities. What is this?
Ryan's Hotel?
Earthly enjoyment in November of 1948, when my sweet little 18-year-old wife and I showed up here right after our marriage. And she had her little winter coat on with a corsage and a big radiant smile. And I don't remember carrying her across the portals, but I might have. And we worked our way into a period of bliss. It was just a wonderful honeymoon cottage. We had a little suite with our own refrigerator and sink, and just perfect for newlyweds. For just a couple of months through the winter months, until we were able to get a more spacious apartment. Plus the fact that we had to give way for the tourist season as it approached. But I don't recall what the rental was, but it was in our budget. So I don't know how we even found the place, but it didn't matter where we were at the time. We didn't care. We were just so much in love, and we just enjoyed finally being married that we had sought to be for such a long time. And I remember driving my 1936 Plymouth, which is kind of running down by that time. It had been in an accident for which I got some money at one time, and I don't recall if it was this particular run from here, but it was just hanging by a basic thread, and we were driving along, and suddenly the damaged fender kind of went up in the air in the breeze at my 40 miles an hour, and I pulled the car over to the side, went out, yanked the fender off, threw it in the side of the road or in the trunk or something, and just drove off the three fenders until I was able to get rid of the car. And they had a little rust spot or two, and it was a tan paint finish. So I took black paint and covered all these little rust spots, and then I painted on the side of it speckled trout. And the foolishness of the young. But we drove that car into the ground. And we were so budget conscious and so poor, we used to collect bottles along the road, and we would cash the bottles in and get a nominal amount of money, as much as 50 cents, and use that to put gasoline in our tank because our income was so at that level. Boy, we made it. And then some. I think it was after Mom, Doris Hengel, sold her home on North Long Street and married Rudy, that Mom and I, or Nancy and I, had to find our own place. And this was one of the homes that we stayed in for a time. This was owned by a couple by the name of Miller, an older couple, very nice folks. And I think maybe we had Michael at the time, but I'm not sure. We stayed here for perhaps between 1 and 2 years as a guest, and then I was promoted by Goodyear to be a field representative in Erie, Pennsylvania. 3-county sales territory working out of Erie, covering Chautauqua County in New York, and Erie and Crawford counties in Pennsylvania. And the district sales manager came by to pick me up and drive me down there to look over the territory and explain things. And he picked me up, and it was kind of a windy day, and my hair was pretty long. And he saw my hair all over the place, and he said, "This is not going to work. You can't go out selling Goodyear products without a hat." So he made me go and buy a business hat and put it on so that I would look more respectable when I called on the dealers. And then back in here, of course, is the St. Peter and Paul's Church. And Jay and I, at that time, years ago, there was a railroad embankment. At that time, years ago, there was a railroad embankment. At that time, years ago, there was a railroad embankment. At that time, years ago, there was a railroad embankment.